Syria's armed and political opposition will negotiate with the government next month after agreeing for the first time on a process to end the war. So which factions are involved and, as important, which aren't? And what hope is there for next month's talks with the Syrian government? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Martine Dennis. Now, 100 delegates from a spectrum of armed and political opposition groups have agreed on how they want to end Syria's war. They'll be negotiating with President Assad's government next month. But some of the biggest groups controlling territory on the ground in Syria, Al-Nusra Front, ISIL and the Kurds, they weren't involved. And not all the groups who are involved make natural allies with the West. Before we bring in our guests, Al Jazeera's Omar Al-Saleh sets things up from Istanbul.
Some of the main fighting groups in Syria were present in Riyadh to unite and form one front to negotiate with the government of President Bashar al-Assad. Those groups include Ahrar al-Sham, the Army of Islam, the Northern Front and the Southern Fronts. These are both umbrella groups representing a number of rebel groups. All of those control large parts in the north, the east and south of Syria. They are also backed by regional powers. And also present at that meeting is the so-called moderate Syrian opposition, which is backed and armed by the United States. Now, there could be a push for peace in Syria, but without reaching an agreement between regional powers and international powers on the fate of President Bashar al-Assad, and any future role for him needs to be decided now. Otherwise, the war in Syria will continue. Omar Al-Saleh for Inside Story, Istanbul.
All right, let's bring in our guests now. Joining me here in the studio in Doha is Marwan Karbalan, Associate Analyst at the Doha Institute Arab Centre for Research and Policy Studies. From Dubai, via Skype, we have Ubay Shabanda, who is Managing Director of Orient Media. And in London, James Denslow, Research Associate at the Foreign Policy Centre. Welcome to you all, but Marwan, can I start with you and find out what your thoughts are about the significance regarding this statement, which is a framework, if you like, a framework of how to proceed?
Well, I think it's very significant, in my opinion, because this is the first time that the biggest part of the Syrian opposition, both political and armed, from inside and outside Syria, have come together actually and agreed on a certain issues that are, in my opinion, have always been a matter of controversy among them. One of them is, for example, the future of Syria. They all agreed that Syria will have a civil democratic government, and all minorities and the right of minorities will be protected, and so on. So, I mean, the meeting was, in my opinion, very important. It's also important because it came after the Vienna Declaration, which actually the regional and international powers, they agreed on a roadmap to peace in Syria. And one of the steps actually in this roadmap was bringing together the Syrian opposition in order to agree and form a united delegation in order to start this negotiation process with the regime. This has not been possible over the past 4 years, and it became now possible. I mean, this is why I think it's also significant.
And Ubay, in Dubai, how representative would you say these groups assembled in Riyadh, how representative are they of Syrians on the ground?
Well, I think given the wide spectrum amongst various groups that were present in the Riyadh conference, I think fairly representative. We have members from the national coalition, from the principal Syrian opposition body that is in exile, but you also have representatives from independent Syrian opposition personalities. You have representatives on the negotiating team, on the High Commission for the negotiating team, that are coming from the national coordination body, which is an opposition body that is moderately tolerated by some elements of the regime. So given the wide array of various individuals, to include both political members of the opposition and armed members of the opposition from northern Syria, eastern Syria, in southern Syria, I think it is absolutely unique that we are seeing for the first time a more broadly array of representative Syrian members of the opposition that will be at the negotiating table in Vienna come this January. So this is definitely a very positive development.
OK, so James, we have a broad spectrum of Syrian opinion represented at the Riyadh talks. Let's call them the Riyadh group. Let's talk about those, though, who weren't invited. The Kurds, for instance, ISIL.
Yes, I mean, the Syrian opposition is incredibly complex, fluctuating in its alliances, its umbrellas, its partnerships, its practical relationships, and it's good that you've got Marwan in the studio who knows this subject very well. I think the basic points have been made about the fact is that these are the main players, supposedly 65 armed groups and political actors in one place. The FSA Southern Command described the Riyadh group as 10 times more powerful than any other opposition group in the country. But of course there are some elephants in the room, the most obvious being ISIS, ISIL and the Nusra Front, who are considered beyond the pale when it comes to any political process. Slightly more controversial is of course the exclusion of Kurdish groups in the north and some other Arab and Christian groups that have now actually in response formed their own umbrella. So it'll be interesting to see what role they play going forward. But let's not forget, this all comes out of the Vienna process, which saw for the first time all of the major regional and international actors in one room, but crucially no Syrians. And so, in a sense, the Syrian peace process has become too important to be left to the Syrians. And I think that is perhaps a reflection of how divided the various actors on the ground are.
And Marwan, is this a very serious omission, not inviting the Kurds, not incorporating the Kurds in this process? Let's start with the Kurds first and then talk about the others who haven't been invited.
Well, I think when you talk about the Kurds, we can't talk about one body from Kurds, because the Kurds are also divided. And some of them actually were present at the Riyadh meeting. But if we are talking about the BYD, for example, the opposition believes that the BYD is an ally of the regime and an ally of the Iranians, an ally of the Russians. So it should be on the other camp. It should be on the other side, not with the side of the opposition. I mean, that was actually the position of the opposition on the Kurdish question. But I think some of them were there because don't forget, even the coalition, the national coalition, includes some Kurds. Most prominent among them is Abdel Basit Sida, who was yesterday actually acting as a spokesperson for the Riyadh meeting. So some of them were actually present at the meeting. But let me just go back to the point of Nusra and ISIS. I think the exclusion of Nusra and ISIS is something deliberate because they don't want them actually to be included in this process. The whole issue actually is to fight ISIS and Nusra. I mean, the whole process, if you think of the Vienna process, the whole Vienna process is not only about stopping the war in Syria, but bringing the different parties actually to form one united front in order to fight both ISIS.
Indeed. Now, this is a point I want to pick up with you a little bit later on, but in the meantime, let's have a look at who controls what. As we've been saying, there are several groups in Syria who weren't part of the talks in Riyadh. There's ISIL, which holds much of eastern Syria, including the main oil fields. The Kurds, who hold a portion of northern Syria, they weren't invited. Those two groups have pushed Assad government forces to the west, so most of its territory lies along the border with Lebanon, which leaves this portion of Syria to a range of opposition groups, including al-Nusra Front, which is linked to al-Qaeda. They haven't been invited either. Of the more than 100 rebel groups, only 10 were in Riyadh for this week's talks. And Ubay, in Dubai, can I come back to you then and suggest that this might be a very serious omission indeed, not to have incorporated groups at whatever level, in whatever format, rebels who control such a large portion of the country on the ground?
Well, I'll tell you one consequence of this is that, and I believe it is absolutely deliberate, you have to look back at the set of principles that the rebel groups in Riyadh agreed to. Principally, they agreed to abide by democracy, civil state, rule of law, and specifically and notably to fight terrorism. Now, the fact that the rebel groups include the armed groups in northern Syria and southern Syria, Ahrar al-Sham Islamic Army, the Free Syrian Army divisions that are backed by the West and the Gulf allies, the fact that they included an agreement to fight terrorism, to support a civil state, and to support democracy puts them in direct odds, not only against the al-Nusra Front, but also obviously against ISIS. Now, the positive development here is that this gives the Russians and the Iranians absolutely no excuse to go back and say, well, the first item of discussion in any negotiations in Vienna should be to fight terrorism and not establishing a process for transitioning Syria to a post-Assad state. So I think this actually is a positive development to have excluded ISIS and to excluded al-Nusra. We are seeing a greater divide between al-Nusra and the Sunni rebel groups in the north. And the reality is that the Sunni rebel groups are directly fighting ISIS at the same time as they pursue a political negotiating process. So this gives Vladimir Putin and the Iranians who are backing the Assad regime very little pretext to go back to Vienna and say that these groups are not serious about fighting terrorism. So I think the rug here is pulled out from under the Assad regime and from the Russians in terms of their political negotiating starting position.
James, can I put to you a quote attributed to the Iranian Deputy Foreign Minister Hossein Amir Abdullahian? He said, apparently, "We will never allow terrorists to rebrand themselves as moderate opposition." Has this process allowed some of those groups that the West would rather prefer to describe as terrorist or as extreme or whatever tag they want to use, has this allowed groups like that to almost reinvent themselves for the purposes of political gain?
Well, I think that terms like moderate and extremist have been bandied about and are not particularly helpful for understanding the conflict. I always think, how can you be a moderate in such an extreme environment in Syria? And certainly the use of the word terrorism, which seems to be used by absolutely everyone to describe who they are fighting against, again, is not particularly productive. But what Vienna does, and I agree with my colleague who spoke previous, this is a chance to almost distill the opposition, to allow a degree of clarity as to some of these complex relationships that do move, for example, connections to al-Nusra Front in particular. And I think that's, I mean, bear in mind the deadlines for the Vienna process are pretty tight. So we've got opposition government talks scheduled to kick off in the new year. Then we've got this transitional government phase. Then we have this constitutional review and elections within 18 months. And so there's a huge amount to happen within a short period of time. And perhaps that kind of urgency will somehow or other mean that issues such as whether the Iranians or the Saudis can agree on who is and who isn't acceptable within the process will simply be steamrolled over on the basis of the major powers deciding that it will proceed. And we haven't yet even talked about, of course, the question of Assad himself.
Absolutely. Let's come to that as well. But first, let me just bring in what Syrian President Bashar al-Assad has said most recently in response to the Riyadh element of this process. He said there's a big difference between militants, terrorists and opposition. Opposition, he said, is a political term, not a military term. And he said, for us in Syria, everyone who holds a machine gun is a terrorist. Now, Marwan, that almost takes you back to square one, doesn't it? Given that the opposition groups have compromised significantly in some cases in order to present a united front, some of them abandoning what could be condemned as being slightly extremist positions. They've abandoned those positions in order to be part of this next stage of the process. And President Assad comes out and says, anybody who's used a gun, I'm not talking to anyway.
Absolutely. As you said, I mean, he's bringing, the whole process into square one. This is where we all started, actually, this conflict. And I think he's somehow echoing the position of both his biggest allies, the Iranians and the Russians, because yesterday, Russia was expressing its frustration at the slow process of actually naming and shaming the terrorist groups in Syria, i.e. they wanted Jordan actually to be quicker in actually coming up with the list that they agreed upon on having during the Vienna meeting. And they wanted actually some of the groups that have attended the Riyadh meeting to be included, most prominently Ahrar al-Sham and the Army of Islam. So yes, I think they are trying to sabotage the whole process by actually trying to argue that we are not going to, because these are the same terrorists that we have been actually trying to eliminate from the very beginning, and we are not going to talk to them. So I think this is going to be a little bit difficult actually to overcome. And I think also the Russians will be trying, because they have been trying over the past couple of months since they started this military intervention in Syria, to destroy the very groups that are now present in the Riyadh meeting. They have not actually targeted ISIL in a very genuine way. but they have been targeting Ahrar al-Sham and the so-called moderate opposition Islamist groups, actually like Ahrar al-Sham and the Army of Islam. So I mean, this is the whole process is actually now around this argument.
Ubay, in Dubai, we've been talking about the compromises that have been made by this variety, this myriad of Syrian opposition groups. One of the major compromises does appear to be the role of President Assad in the period leading up to the establishment of a transitional government. They've accepted that he can be part of negotiations. That's significant as well, isn't it?
It is significant because it shows a level of flexibility, but nonetheless, the opposition groups that met in Riyadh stressed in their final communique that a transitional process must begin as part of the negotiations. The Geneva II communique spells it out very clearly. A transitional governing body must be the foundation for any negotiations moving forward. Now, what that means is that the removal of Assad is not a precondition, but Assad must be removed from power as part of the process. At some point in the negotiating process, the rebel groups in Riyadh have provided a time frame of 6 weeks from the negotiations in which a transitional governing body must begin, where Bashar al-Assad must leave power. Now, this still leaves them at odds with the position of the Assad regime and with the stated positions of the Iranians, which claims that Bashar al-Assad and his fate should not be part of any negotiating process in Vienna. So I think there are still some major obstacles moving forward. Hopefully, though, that there will be some greater degree of willpower by the international community to implement and enforce the principles of the Geneva Communique, which lay out very clearly a peace process for Syria in which Bashar al-Assad is no longer in power.
James, nobody ever said it was going to be easy, did they? But the next stage of this process is that the Riyadh group select a committee which will actually do the negotiations with the Syrian government.
You know, with a 6-week deadline on Assad's transition, this whole process could unravel fairly quickly. It's interesting that the international players who convened Vienna, really did kick the can down the road a bit on the question of Assad by constantly referring to this sort of mythical word transition, because of course transition can mean weeks, it can mean months, it can mean years. And I think we've still really got to sort of understand very quickly, I think, when talks begin, what kind of compromises people are willing to reach when it comes to a transition, because as you refer to, Assad's recent public statements have been very bolshy about the process only really starting once terrorism is being defeated, and about the Syrian people ultimately being the people who will decide his future, not any sort of a separate political process in and of itself. So what's different, I feel now, going back again to this point, that whereas in Geneva, Assad was almost allowed to sort of play the system, play for time, make commitments that weren't lived up to, or wait for the opposition to shoot themselves in the foot. With Vienna, because it's more controlled by external backers that are also close to himself, he is less able to sort of drive the process in directions that he will want to. So the question really is, can the process be Assad-proof? Can it deliver a transition that's acceptable for the opposition? Can it maybe look to moving power both horizontally into the regions and down into, say, the Syrian parliament, so that Assad's role is increasingly seen to be having a clear endpoint rather than an issue that somehow or other sabotages the whole process right from the off?
And Marwan, increasingly we refer to the outside powers, don't we? They indeed are scheduled to meet later on in the month, December the 18th, I believe, in New York. They are so critical, aren't they? Do you get the impression that they're actually creating a momentum that is sustainable and that's genuine, coming from the Syrian actors in the conflict? Or do you feel that this is something perhaps being imposed from outside upon the Syrian people?
Well, I think if you look at the Vienna process, and if you even go to the Geneva Declaration of 2012, I mean, the Syrians also were not there, and the regime was not there, the opposition was not there. And I think the whole process actually excluded if we are talking about this understanding between the regional and international, because I mean this war has become a war by proxy from the early stages of this conflict, and I think the role of the regional and international war was too great actually to ignore, and now in fact the whole issue is becoming about regional and international powers having their own understandings, and we have seen that in Vienna when 17 powers actually regional and international met and agreed on the Geneva roadmap. So I think yes, what we are seeing here actually is an implementation, a sort of implementation of the Vienna process, which have been agreed by the great powers actually and imposed on the Syrians. And what we have seen in the meeting in Riyadh is only one step of that process. They called upon the Syrian opposition to meet and to agree on a political budget.
But this is complete Syrian involvement in the Syrian problem, isn't it? The Riyadh stage of this process.
Absolutely. At the end of the day, you have to bring the parties to this conflict, I mean, together in order to start this negotiation process. Otherwise, I mean, you are not going to stop this conflict. But before that, we have to have this framework, regional and international agreement in order to have this process started in the very beginning. And we have seen over the past, actually, a few months that the Americans and the Russians are working sort of perhaps becoming more committed to this political process than they used to be in the past. Why? Because we have seen the consequences of the Syrian conflict not contained within Syrian borders as it used to be, but now we have seen actually Syria exporting two things, I mean, to the West mainly. I mean, refugees, I mean, this is how the West actually see it, refugees and terrorists. And this is why they want actually to do something in order to bring this conflict to an end. I mean, let's hope that this works at the end of the day, and let's hope that what happened in Riyadh is only, I mean, the first step in the right path to peace in Syria.
And Ubay, in Dubai, is this political manoeuvring likely to have any impact on the actual fighting on the ground? Is this likely to lead to any improvement in the lives of Syrian civilians, many of whom, of course, are being held under siege? As we've seen recently in the case of Homs, a little agreement was made whereby fighters were able to exit and relief was able to go in for the besieged people of this particular district of Homs. Do you think we might see more agreements on the ground, local agreements like that could ease the suffering of Syrian people?
Well, at issue here is the fact that the Assad regime views any opposition, whether it's civil or armed, as being inherently terrorist, as in accordance to the Assad regime's view of all those that oppose it. The part of that reason is because the Assad ruling family views his regime as being akin to the state. So that's going to be very problematic as we move forward, given the fact that we have Sunni rebel forces fighting a variety of terrorist groups, whether it's al-Nusra or ISIS. Now, going back to the realities on the ground, one of the confidence-building measures that the rebel groups in Riyadh are calling upon is for the cessation of all barrel bombs, all aerial attacks against civilian areas, and they are calling upon the Assad regime and its associated Shia militias to lift the sieges against opposition-held neighborhoods and villages, starvation sieges, and to end the forced displacement, which many refer to as ethnic cleansing, that the Assad regime and its associated militias.
Okay, Ubay, I'm going to have to hurry you along because I'm afraid we are running out of time. And can I put a final point then to James in London? And wonder whether, in fact, this might have the opposite effect and might lead the various armed groups on the ground to go for all-out fighting in order to secure as much territory as possible before going into negotiations, strengthening their hands.
Potentially. I mean, there's definitely the idea that actions on the ground will affect actions in the various chambers of diplomacy. But we have seen, obviously, an exodus from Homs that was managed. We've got de Mistura talking about local ceasefires. We have 150 days or less than 150 days until a wider ceasefire as vis-a-vis the Vienna agreement. So I think there's a lot of potential for positives, and I think Marwan is spot on. Let's not forget the reason the Vienna process was agreed to was the fact that 250,000 people have died, the fact that the region is saturated with refugees, that terrorism and a refugee crisis is affecting Europe as well. That's the reason that the Russians and the Americans are pushing. That's the reason we've got the Iranians and the Saudis on board for the first time, it seems, with the process to deal with Syria. So it's very fragile, it's very ambitious, but ultimately it is the best game in town.
So a big thank you then to Ubay Shabanda, talking to us from Dubai, for James Denslow, who's talking to us from London, and of course to you, Marwan Kabalan, here in Doha with me. Thank you all very much indeed. And as ever, thank you for watching. As always, you can leave your comments on the programme's page of our website, aljazeera.com. You can post your views on facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or tweet us at AJ Inside Story. From me, Martine Dennis, and the whole team, it's goodbye for now.